You finally open up to her. After months of being the strong, reliable guy she can depend on, you decide to share something real. Your fears about your career, your anxiety about your father's health, your genuine emotions about something that matters deeply to you. You expect understanding, connection, maybe even deeper intimacy. Instead, you watch something shift in her eyes. A flicker of discomfort, a subtle withdrawal, a change in energy that feels like watching someone step away from something unpleasant. Later, she can't quite explain why she feels differently about you, but she does. She calls it the ick, that indefinable feeling that something is just wrong. You're left confused, hurt, and convinced that emotional honesty in relationships is a trap designed to destroy male attractiveness. You wonder if you should have stayed closed off, kept being the emotional rock, maintained the performance that seemed to work until it didn't. Today, I'm going to reveal the hidden psychological machinery behind one of the most misunderstood phenomena in modern relationships, why women get the ick when men show emotions, and how this response isn't about the emotions themselves, but about something far more complex that most people never recognize. Men operate sophisticated emotional compression systems that function like psychological pressure cookers, transforming complex emotional experiences into manageable, socially acceptable outputs that maintain stability for everyone around them while creating invisible cognitive loads that drain their mental resources. This compression engine represents a form of emotional labor that operates so seamlessly that most people, including the men performing it, never recognize it as work. You absorb stress from your job, your family, your relationship, your financial pressures, and your social obligations, then compress all of that emotional complexity into calm, stable, problem-solving energy that others can depend on. The engine requires constant cognitive effort to maintain. You're simultaneously feeling anxiety about your mortgage payment while projecting confidence about your family's financial security. You're processing grief about your friend's death while maintaining emotional availability for your partner's work drama. You're managing your own depression while serving as the optimistic voice that keeps everyone else motivated. This compression creates what psychologists call cognitive load, the mental effort required to simultaneously experience authentic emotions while producing socially required emotional performances. The load exhausts your psychological resources even when you're not consciously aware of the effort involved. Women rarely witness the compression process because the entire point of compression is to produce smooth, processed emotional outputs rather than raw emotional experiences. They see the final product, your stability, your calm, your reliability, without understanding the complex psychological machinery that creates these outputs. The compression engine becomes invisible infrastructure that supports relationship dynamics, family stability, and social functioning while remaining completely unrecognized as skilled emotional labor that deserves acknowledgement, appreciation, or reciprocal support from the people who benefit from its operation. Society demands emotional suppression from men, while simultaneously criticizing men for being emotionally unavailable, creating impossible psychological double binds where authentic emotional expression and emotional suppression both result in social penalties that make healthy emotional regulation nearly impossible to achieve. The paradox operates through contradictory cultural messages that punish men regardless of their emotional choices, express emotions and face accusations of weakness, neediness, or inappropriate behavior, suppress emotions and face accusations of emotional unavailability, toxic masculinity, or relationship incompetence. This conditioning begins in childhood, where boys learn that certain emotional expressions are socially acceptable, while others trigger immediate consequences. Anger gets tolerated or even encouraged as masculine expression. Sadness, fear, vulnerability, or need for comfort get discouraged as feminine qualities that compromise masculine identity. The conditioning extends into romantic relationships, where women claim to want emotional openness, while simultaneously losing attraction when that openness reveals anything beyond carefully controlled vulnerability that serves relationship purposes rather than authentic emotional processing needs. Men learn to navigate this paradox by developing sophisticated emotional filtering systems that determine which emotions are safe to express, which contexts allow emotional honesty, and which people can handle authentic masculine emotional experiences without withdrawal or judgment. The paradox creates emotional authenticity deficits, where men lose contact with their genuine emotional lives because constant filtering and editing of emotional expression eventually disconnects them from their actual feelings, needs, and psychological experiences. Most importantly, the social conditioning paradox prevents healthy emotional development because it teaches men that emotional expression is a performance for others rather than a natural human process that serves psychological health, relationship intimacy, and authentic self-knowledge. Women have been socially trained to expect specific types of emotional expression from men that serve feminine psychological needs rather than masculine emotional authenticity, creating mismatched expectations that trigger negative responses when men express emotions that don't fit predetermined feminine frameworks for acceptable masculine vulnerability. The response matrix operates through cultural programming that teaches women to value emotional expression from men only when that expression makes women feel needed, valued, or emotionally special rather than when that expression serves genuine masculine psychological needs or authentic emotional processing. Women often respond positively to masculine vulnerability that positions them as healers, supporters, or emotional experts who can provide comfort and guidance. They respond negatively to masculine emotional expression that reveals men as complete human beings with complex inner lives that don't center feminine validation or support. The matrix includes expectations that masculine emotions should be presented gradually, in digestible portions, with appropriate timing that considers feminine emotional capacity rather than masculine emotional needs. Men are expected to regulate their emotional expression based on what women can handle, rather than based on what men actually need to process. This creates emotional labor dynamics, where men must not only compress their own emotions, but also carefully calibrate the presentation of those emotions to maintain feminine comfort levels. Men become responsible for managing both their authentic emotional experiences and feminine responses to those experiences. The response matrix punishes men for emotional authenticity that doesn't serve feminine psychological needs, while rewarding emotional performances that make women feel valued, needed, or special. This trains men to perform emotions rather than experience them authentically. Most dangerously, the matrix teaches women to interpret masculine emotional needs as emotional burdens rather than natural human experiences that deserve support, understanding, and reciprocal care in healthy relationships. Traditional gender roles created clear expectations for masculine emotional behavior that, while restrictive, provided consistent frameworks for acceptable emotional expression. Modern gender role disruptions have eliminated these frameworks without replacing them with coherent alternatives, leaving men navigating emotional territory without reliable maps. The battlefield operates through conflicting cultural messages about masculinity that simultaneously demand traditional masculine emotional suppression and progressive masculine emotional openness without providing clear guidelines for when, how, or with whom emotional expression is appropriate or beneficial. Women participate in this battlefield by holding contradictory expectations that reflect their own confusion about what they actually want from masculine partners. They intellectually value emotional openness while viscerally responding negatively to emotional expression that challenges traditional masculine roles they unconsciously depend on for psychological security. The revolution creates role-reversed relationship dynamics where some women expect men to become the emotionally expressive partners, while women maintain emotional distance and stability. These reversals often fail because they conflict with biological and psychological patterns that have evolved over thousands of years. Men caught in the battlefield face social punishment regardless of their choices. Traditional masculine emotional suppression gets criticized as toxic masculinity. Progressive masculine emotional expression gets criticized as weakness or neediness that triggers feminine ick responses. The battlefield extends beyond individual relationships into workplace dynamics, social interactions, and family relationships where changing expectations about masculine emotional behavior create ongoing uncertainty about appropriate responses to emotional situations. Most importantly, the gender role battlefield prevents both men and women from developing healthy, authentic emotional relationships because everyone is trying to navigate changing rules rather than building on stable foundations of mutual understanding and respect. Men often release emotional pressure in concentrated bursts that overwhelm feminine emotional processing capacity, while women distribute emotional processing across multiple relationships and time periods. creating fundamental mismatches in emotional communication styles that trigger ick responses when volume exceeds capacity. The miscalibration crisis operates because men and women have developed different strategies for handling emotional intensity based on different social networks, different biological stress responses, and different cultural training about appropriate emotional management techniques. Men typically develop tight-knit social networks where emotional expression happens infrequently but intensely between people who share similar emotional compression capabilities. When men apply this communication style to romantic relationships, they often exceed feminine emotional processing limits. Women typically develop broader social networks that allow emotional distribution across multiple relationships, reducing individual emotional loads while maintaining ongoing emotional processing. This distribution strategy creates different capacity limits for receiving concentrated emotional expression from single sources. The crisis includes timing miscalibrations, where men release emotional pressure when they reach personal breaking points, rather than when their partners have capacity to receive and process emotional information effectively. This creates situations where emotional authenticity feels overwhelming rather than intimate. Miscalibration also occurs through intensity mismatches, where masculine emotional expression operates at volumes that feel natural for masculine psychology, but exceed feminine comfort zones, triggering defensive responses that get interpreted as ick, rather than recognized as capacity limitations. The most destructive aspect of volume miscalibration is that it teaches men that emotional expression itself is problematic, rather than teaching appropriate emotional calibration skills that match expression to audience capacity and context appropriateness. Relationships operate through invisible emotional labor distributions, where women perform ongoing emotional maintenance while men perform emotional compression, but only feminine emotional labor gets recognized and valued, while masculine emotional labor remains invisible and unappreciated, creating resentment and imbalance. The asymmetry machine operates by defining emotional labor only as traditionally feminine activities like planning, caretaking, and emotional mirroring, while ignoring masculine emotional labor like stress absorption, stability maintenance, and emotional compression that supports relationship functionality. Women perform emotional labor that feels like work because it involves obvious activities like remembering birthdays, managing social calendars, and processing relationship problems through conversation. Men perform emotional labor that doesn't feel like work because it involves internal psychological processes like suppressing stress responses and maintaining calm during crises. The machine creates situations where women feel overburdened by emotional labor, while men feel unrecognized for their emotional contributions, leading to conflicts where both partners feel underappreciated for their different but equally valuable emotional contributions to relationship stability. Asymmetry also includes different emotional labor expectations, where women expect men to increase traditionally feminine emotional labor without reducing their own traditionally masculine emotional labor, creating increased overall emotional burden for men without corresponding decreases in responsibility. The machine prevents recognition that healthy relationships require both types of emotional labor, ongoing maintenance and crisis compression, and that problems arise when either type becomes exclusively assigned to one gender, rather than distributed based on individual strengths and relationship needs. Most importantly, emotional labor asymmetry creates conditions where feminine emotional needs get prioritized, while masculine emotional needs get ignored, leading to relationships where men provide emotional support without receiving equivalent emotional support in return. Men and women utilize fundamentally different social network strategies for emotional processing that create amplification effects when misapplied to romantic relationships, resulting in ick responses that stem from network design incompatibilities rather than emotional expression problems. The amplification system operates through network architecture differences, where masculine networks are designed for high-intensity, low-frequency emotional exchanges between people with similar emotional compression capabilities, while feminine networks are designed for moderate intensity, high-frequency emotional distribution across multiple relationships. Men often mistake romantic partners for masculine network connections, applying high-intensity emotional expression strategies that work perfectly in male friendships, but overwhelm feminine processing capabilities. This creates amplification effects where appropriate masculine emotional expression becomes inappropriate feminine emotional burden. Women often mistake romantic partners for feminine network nodes, expecting emotional distribution capabilities that allow ongoing emotional processing without recognition, that men typically function as emotional sinks rather than emotional distributors in network systems. The system includes capacity mismatches where masculine emotional expression requires feminine emotional compression that women haven't developed because their networks typically distribute rather than compress emotional loads. This creates situations where feminine ick responses protect against emotional overload rather than rejecting masculine authenticity. Network effect amplification also occurs when women expect men to develop feminine network capabilities while maintaining masculine network functions, creating impossible expectations that men should simultaneously compress emotions for stability and distribute emotions for intimacy. The most significant aspect of network amplification is that it creates relationship failures that stem from network design, incompatibilities, rather than fundamental relationship problems, leading to breakups that could be avoided through better understanding of different emotional processing architectures. Emotional expression operates through complex contextual factors, including timing, intensity, audience capacity, and social expectations that create navigation challenges, where the same emotional expression can produce completely different responses depending on contextual variables that most people never consciously recognize. The navigation maze operates through invisible contextual rules that determine appropriate emotional expression based on factors like relationship stage, stress levels, social setting, and individual psychological capacity that vary constantly and unpredictably across different situations and relationships. Men must simultaneously navigate their authentic emotional needs while considering feminine emotional capacity, social appropriateness, timing sensitivity, and intensity calibration without clear guidelines about how these factors interact or when they should be prioritized over authentic expression needs. The maze includes gradual expression requirements, where emotional sharing must be titrated carefully to avoid overwhelming recipients, while still providing authentic communication that serves relationship intimacy and personal psychological health. This requires sophisticated emotional intelligence that few people develop naturally. Contextual navigation also involves audience assessment skills, where men must evaluate individual capacity for receiving emotional information while considering broader social and cultural factors that influence how emotional expression will be interpreted and responded to. The maze creates situations where emotional authenticity requires strategic thinking rather than spontaneous expression, transforming natural human emotional communication into complex performance management that exhausts psychological resources while reducing authentic intimacy. If you're beginning to understand why masculine emotional expression creates such complex social dynamics and want to learn how to navigate these challenges without sacrificing authenticity, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The psychological patterns I'm revealing operate below conscious awareness for most people, but understanding them can transform how you approach emotional communication in relationships. Society operates punishment mechanisms that penalize both men and women for emotional expressions that deviate from assigned gender roles, creating effective deviance consequences that discourage authentic emotional expression while maintaining artificially rigid gender-based emotional expectations. The penalty system operates through social consequences that range from subtle discomfort to overt rejection for emotional expressions that conflict with gender-based expectations about appropriate feeling and expression patterns. Men face penalties for excessive emotional expression, while women face penalties for insufficient emotional expression. Effective deviance penalties include ick responses that function as social enforcement mechanisms designed to discourage gender role violations rather than responses to inappropriate behavior. These responses often operate below conscious awareness, making them feel like natural reactions rather than socially programmed enforcement behaviors. The system creates double binds where authentic emotional expression violates gender expectations, while inauthentic emotional suppression violates relationship expectations, leaving individuals trapped between competing social demands that cannot be simultaneously satisfied. Penalties extend beyond romantic relationships into professional settings, friendships, and family dynamics, where emotional expression that deviates from gender norms triggers social consequences that discourage future authentic expression and encourage continued performance of appropriate gender roles. The penalty system maintains gender-based emotional inequality, by punishing individuals who attempt to develop full emotional ranges that include both traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine emotional expressions and capabilities. Most importantly, effective deviance penalties prevent emotional growth and authentic relationship development by discouraging the emotional risk-taking necessary for genuine intimacy, vulnerability, and mutual understanding between partners who could otherwise develop deeper connections. Scientific research reveals that emotional compression imposes genuine cognitive costs on men, including increased stress responses, depleted willpower reserves, and neurological strain that contradicts cultural narratives about masculine, emotional suppression being natural or psychologically beneficial. The reality check operates through empirical evidence that demonstrates emotional compression as skilled psychological labor rather than natural masculine behavior, revealing that men who appear emotionally stable are actually performing complex cognitive work that deserves recognition rather than expectation. Research shows that role-reversed relationships where women provide emotional compression while men provide emotional expression face significant social bias and judgment that creates additional stress for couples attempting to organize emotional labor based on individual strengths rather than gender expectations. The check includes neurological evidence that emotional suppression activates stress response systems, including amygdala activation and cortisol production that create measurable physical and mental health consequences for men who chronically suppress emotional expression to maintain social acceptability. Feminist research increasingly recognizes masculine-coded emotional labor as valuable pro-social contribution rather than patriarchal oppression, acknowledging that men's emotional compression serves community stability and relationship functionality in ways that deserve appreciation rather than criticism. Research also reveals that successful emotional expression requires matching intensity to audience capacity, validating the importance of calibrated emotional communication rather than unlimited emotional authenticity that ignores recipient psychological limitations and social contextual factors. Most importantly, psychological research provides evidence-based frameworks for understanding emotional expression challenges that move beyond gender-blame narratives toward practical solutions that serve both masculine and feminine psychological needs in healthy relationship dynamics. Effective emotional expression requires developing sophisticated emotional intelligence that includes both expression capabilities and compression capabilities, allowing individuals to share authentically while considering audience capacity, timing appropriateness, and relationship dynamics that influence communication success. The integration protocol operates through skills development that includes emotional self-awareness, audience assessment, timing calibration, intensity regulation, and network utilization that transform emotional expression from spontaneous reaction into strategic communication that serves both authenticity and relationship health. Integration requires understanding that emotional intelligence involves knowing when to express emotions, how much emotion to express, which emotions serve relationship purposes, and which emotions require processing through other channels before romantic relationship sharing becomes appropriate or beneficial. The protocol includes developing emotional decompression strategies that utilize appropriate networks for intensive emotional processing, while reserving romantic relationships for emotional sharing that enhances intimacy rather than creating burden or overwhelming feminine processing capabilities. Emotional intelligence integration also involves recognizing that healthy relationships require both partners to develop both traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine emotional capabilities rather than maintaining rigid gender-based emotional role divisions that limit relationship functionality. The protocol extends beyond individual skill development to include relationship negotiation about emotional labor distribution, capacity limitations, network utilization, and support strategies that serve both partners' psychological needs rather than defaulting to cultural expectations about gender-appropriate emotional behavior. Most importantly, emotional intelligence integration creates opportunities for authentic emotional connection that respects individual differences while building mutual understanding, support, and appreciation for different emotional processing styles and capabilities. Understanding why women get the ick isn't about learning to suppress your emotions or becoming emotionally unavailable. It's about recognizing the complex psychological and social systems that influence emotional communication while developing skills that allow authentic expression without overwhelming your partner's processing capacity. The woman who's right for you will appreciate your emotional intelligence rather than punishing your emotional authenticity. She'll recognize your emotional compression as valuable labor rather than expecting it as natural masculine behavior. She'll work with you to develop communication patterns that serve both your need for authentic expression and her capacity for emotional support. Real relationships require both partners to understand and respect different emotional processing styles, while building systems that allow mutual support, authentic communication, and shared emotional labor that doesn't exhaust either partner's psychological resources. If this analysis of emotional expression dynamics has revealed patterns you hadn't recognized in your own relationships, subscribe to this channel for deeper insights into the psychology of healthy communication between men and women. Share this video with anyone who's struggled with the balance between emotional authenticity and social expectations. Remember that understanding these systems allows you to navigate them more effectively, rather than being controlled by dynamics you don't recognize or understand.